In this video, we're going to move on down to the particle renderer, and the first property we're going to take a look at is the materials property, technically. Now, there's two properties above this, being cast shadows and receive shadows, which sound really amazing. I mean, you're like, but what if I want my particle system to cast and receive shadows? Well, that's the interesting thing. These two properties are on by default, but by default, they don't do anything.
Right. It's all a matter of the shaders or what shader you use with your particle renderer. And unfortunately, the default shaders that are provided with Unity don't really make use of these two checkboxes.
That's right. They are there in case you're writing your own shaders that do make use of shadows. And in this way, you can utilize casting and receiving of shadows in your particles. But for default purposes, if you're not writing your own shaders, you can pretty much ignore these checkboxes entirely. Now, down from here, we have our materials setup, which is kind of our focus here in this video. This has two little sub-properties. We have size, and we have the elements based on the size. So if I take the size, this is the number of materials that can be applied to each particle. I could set this to, say, 3. And now we have 3 different elements, elements 0, 1, and 2. It's 0 based. Now, a quick note about this. In most cases, you're probably not going to be using more than a single element on your particles, because what this is going to do is literally stack a second material on top of each particle. Now, it does have its uses. If you've got maybe a flare image that you're going to use on one shader and then a little explosion that you're going to use on another, and you need those to take place together for each individual particle, then it can be useful. If you have to animate 2 different stacked effects in different ways, again, it could be useful. But in many cases, you're generally not going to need to do this. I want you to kind of remember, though, if you come to this particle system from, I don't know, Max or Maya, where you might be thinking that you can add individual materials on a per particle basis, no, that's not how this works. If you needed multiple materials on a per particle basis, like you need this particle to have this material, but this particle over here should have this material instead, you just use 2 separate particle systems.
Right. This is more in case if for some reason you're working in, say, Photoshop, and the effect that you're going for can't be accomplished with a single texture, you would use this to create different materials that would get stacked on top of each individual particle. If you remember previously, each particle has its own little polygon that gets drawn. This is just overlaying multiple textures or materials in each one of those polygons.
So what I'm going to do is set this back over to 1. Now down from here you have the actual particle material that you'd like to use. Now I have loaded into my standard assets the particles which are included with Unity. If you haven't loaded those in, you won't be seeing a lot of the same ones that I do. But if we click here on our material, we have several materials we can choose from. Now you can add any material you like. But again, I have some that have been loaded in along with Unity just to keep things simple. You'll notice we've got several different types of fire or flame. And there's a little fairy dust, there's a smoke trail, and there's smoke, and several different types of smoke. There's water splashes and whatnot. And you can play with all of these as you like. I'm just going to grab something simple like, let's grab one of the flames just for a moment and see what we get. So we double-click that. And now when we hit play, actually we could just view it right there. But you see this does look a whole lot more fire-like than it did a moment ago, just because of that material. Now, of course, you'd want to change some of the things about how the particles are behaving to make that even more realistic. But let me pull this back over to fairy dust. Now, I want to throw this out there. As soon as we added a new material to this, we got a shader area. This was not here before. As a matter of fact, if I undo all the way back to the point where we had default particle, you'll notice I can't scroll down any further. That's as far down as I can go. It's as soon as you add a new particle material that you get this shader area.
Right. Also note that unless you undo, there's no way to go back to that default particle once you've selected a different material.
That's right. In most cases, that's going to be just fine. You're generally not just going to use the default material that came along with your particle system. Now, let me go back up here to our particle system and make sure we can select this. Now, without going too far into the realm of shaders, if you take a look at your shader property here, you'll notice we're currently set to particles additive. If you click on this, there are all of the shaders that you have access to by default along with Unity, and you'll notice that particles have their own section. Generally speaking, meaning probably 99 times out of 100, you're going to be using a shader for your particles out of this section. You can use any of them that you like. If you want to, you could drop a diffuse material, or diffuse shader, excuse me, right on top of your particles. But you'll notice some kind of interesting and sort of scary things are taking place with the shadows.
Right, because we have cast shadows and receive shadows on, and this particular shader does take that into consideration, but unfortunately it doesn't implement it correctly.
Yeah, there are problems, and you generally wouldn't want to do this. But I'm just saying, in a pinch, you can. Now I'm going to go back over to particles. And just as a quick rundown, we have additive, which is going to take each particle and add its color information to the particle behind it. So they start to stack. It'll end up pushing generally toward white, or whatever your dominant color happens to be. Now, again, I'm not going to go over each and every one of these with a big long description. Additive soft is just a softer algorithm, so things don't get so harshly pushed out toward white. You have alpha blended, which is going to blend the particles based on an alpha channel that they may have inside the texture. We have multiply. This is going to just simply multiply, just like multiply in Photoshop. It just takes color information and multiplies it together. So you see it kind of gives a darkening effect. Moving down with multiply double is going to take the result and double it. I think it's prior to the multiply, but honestly I don't remember if it's before or after. It looks like it's going to be after. And then from there, we have vertex lit, blended if you need your particles to be vertex lit, and then an additive multiply, which in this case is kind of blowing things out because we're still catching the result of our alpha. Now, let's go ahead and set this back over to something a bit more useful. I'm going to use additive soft, just because you can really see how that kind of softens things up and we don't get pushed so heavily toward white. We have some other tweaks that we can add in here. We can change the texture that's being applied. So if I click on the select button, we can change this over to, I don't know, like maybe flame E if we want to. And so that starts to change that around. Of course, if I did something like that, we'd probably want to start changing some properties of the particles themselves, like maybe give them a little bit of random rotation for starters, so that they're not all pointed in the same direction. And you can see we already have some nice, kind of variation with, how we were shifting toward blue, but since the actual texture was already orange, we're kind of going pale white that's getting richer and richer as you go down. You can change the particle tiling and offset, which is not going to be all that useful to us because our particular texture in this case is just a single picture. But if you had multiple images and you wanted to use a particular one, you could use tiling and offset to really narrow that down, or if you need to tighten up and so on and so forth. You also, in this particular case with this shader, we have a soft particles factor, which controls that softening value. As you tweak this, you can see we can get a really, really soft result or a really bright and in-your-face kind of result. So that's a quick rundown of the materials section. Again, it's just a way for you to add one or more materials to your particles. Once you add one, you lose the default particle, and that unlocks the ability to change what type of shader you're using. I do want to throw this out. If you're following along with any other tutorials or watching anybody else work, or maybe you're opening up an existing Unity asset and you go down to change the shader and you don't see it for some reason, always make your next click to check and make sure you're not using the default particle.
Right. There's one other thing I'd like to put out before we wrap this up.
Sure.
Is in the bottom, once you've selected your material and the bottom option pops up, and you can see where Zach's been modifying the fairy dust material. Remember, whatever you change here affects every other particle system in your entire scene, or for that matter, your entire project that uses that exact same material.
That's right.
So if you adjust it here, everything else that uses fairy dust is going to be changed as well. So if that's not what you want, you're going to have to duplicate that material before you start tweaking it out to what you want.
And in this case, we can do that by jumping under particles, sources, and jump underneath. Where did they hide this? Is it under materials? Yeah, it is. So there's our fairy dust material, and you could duplicate this off and maybe call this like fairy dust 2, or in this case maybe fairy dust flame or something useful. Just make sure that if you don't want to create any lasting effects to this fairy dust particle system, or this fairy dust material, excuse me, that you duplicate it off, and then you can just apply that duplicate right up here inside your material.
Exactly.
So that will wrap things up for this video. Thank you very much for watching.